forward now since trade was raised earlier in the program by the ambassador. Pramit, do you believe that trade is a problem area as far as the bilateral relationship is concerned between the two countries?
Trade is a big issue. In fact, it is probably the single only real obstacle left in the relationship. And that's largely because President Donald Trump himself is obsessed with this issue. The rest of his administration is not overly concerned, simply because the trade surplus that India has with the United States is about 16 to 18 billion dollars, which in trade terms is really insignificant. And if you talk to the Pentagon and the State Department, their basic response is it's not really a big issue, but the president sees this as politically important. Trying since roughly August last year to come to an agreement with the Americans. And if you saw Alice Wells, the senior State Department South Asia officer, spoke at the Atlantic Council a few days ago, she actually said relatively positive things. She said, in fact, we have come to almost broadly agreed on almost every major point now. And a small trade agreement is what the Americans and the Indians hope to get. It may not be possible to get it before the end of this year, but possibly by January next year, in which we'll more or less address the 5 or 6 major issues between the two countries and lead America to revoke the GSP sanctions that they had imposed on India earlier. But otherwise get trade off the table, which is really the big issue, because as I said, trade is not that major a concern between the two countries. So I think we're looking at light at the end of the tunnel on that directly addressed. That's a separate set of negotiations. But if Alice Wells' statement and combined with Piyush Goyal's, our Commerce Minister's public statements on this issue, indicate that we are now 95% of the way to a final agreement to get trade off the table and allow us to move forward in other areas, which the 2+2 covers.
Okay, all right. And, Ambassador, broadening the scope of the discussion now, let's talk about how the bilateral relationship has evolved in recent times, especially having two strong leaders, spearhead the two countries.
Well, President Trump is in some trouble, so I wouldn't call him a terribly strong leader at this time. Though, of course, the indications are that he will override his problems in the Senate. But nonetheless, the relationship has definitely widened a lot in the recent past. The trade issues which have been mentioned by the other panelists also are in the very near term. But the fact of the matter is that we have sent all the positive signals to the United States. We have been one of the biggest buyers of their oil. And in fact, American oil supplies to India now are in excess of $6.7 billion. So the Americans are pretty pleased. You see, President Trump, all said and done, looks to make deals. He looks to have access to markets. He is a businessman. And India has definitely given indications that it is receptive to buying American products. It's another matter that the sort of access he wants to their milk suppliers or their dairy products, all that may be very difficult to provide because, after all, we have our own stakes to look after. However, given the totality of the relationship, where America has an interest in having India as a partner in the Indo-Pacific, where America wants India to continue to play a role in the context of the evolving, where America and India have joint concerns about terrorism emanating from Pakistan. There are reasons to believe that the broad basing of the political relationship will help to iron out other issues also. The other panelists mentioned that there are problems in regard to defense manufacturing, but they also pointed out how certain steps have been taken. For instance, the signing of the Industrial Security Annex, the ISA, which provides for certain safeguards for classified information which is shared until now between the government, but will be shared now between the industrial manufacturing units also. So there are steps being taken to safeguard the interests of the two countries, but at the same time, there are going to be some risks involved which the two countries have to be prepared to take. The challenges are numerous. China is not mentioned, as I said, in the joint statement, clear on the wall for anybody to see. The Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean region is becoming a cause of concern for many countries, including the United States and India. We have some legitimate concerns about Chinese attempts to encircle us. And we are doing our own to sort of make sure that our naval presence and our own ports are able to cope up with any sort of challenge that emerges in the near future. But given the commonality of certain perspectives, there is reason to believe that the two countries will be able to push forward in a variety of respects and will be able to iron out differences to whatever extent is possible. But of course, the history of Indo-US relations has been such that there will be ups and downs.
Right.
There will be 2 steps forward and then maybe a step backward. But nonetheless, I see that the process of moving the relationship forward slowly but steadily is very much going on, and the signs are hope to us in this regard.
Okay. Since we're talking about China, General, how far do you believe that the US is willing to go to check China's hegemony in the region, especially in the South China Sea and in the Indian Ocean?
In my view, when we are looking at the free and open passage in the South China Sea, I do not see the United States compromising on that particular stand. And that is something which the Chinese are also very focused on, because they have actually built certain islands. They have made claims over certain territories which are in contention with other countries like with Philippines and with Vietnam. And they consider all that as being a part of the Chinese Chinese country, So if you are looking at that, then any island which you have in the ocean, you get that 200 nautical miles of that area which is yours, and it really expands your space. Now, what the Chinese, if for some reason the Chinese have always been thinking of the South China Sea as being China's sea or the East China Sea. I mean, they want to lay claim to the whole thing, and that is not going to be permitted. They have been very active there. They have actually set up a no-flying zone over there. Tailing American aircraft, American ships. They have tailed Australian ships. But I think the Americans are not going to back down on this particular one, because if they back down here, then that will indicate that the Chinese have won this particular battle. So
Right.
I think
but talking about backing down, General, as far as Afghanistan is concerned, though it's a different ball game altogether. The Americans want to pull out. Even the Defense Secretary only a few days ago said that he wants to pull out another 4,000 troops from Afghanistan. So where does this leave India and others in that particular region?
I think Afghanistan is going to be a very problematic issue, and it is not going to go away. The good point is, not a good point, let me say a positive to the whole thing is the Americans are not going to withdraw 100% of their troops. They are just withdrawing 4,000. I think they've got 13,000 troops there. And the balance will, I'm not sure how many they've got there, but 13,000? Yeah, 13,000 troops there.
12 to 13,000.
12 to 13,000. So when they pull out 4, there will still be a reasonable component there. I do not think ever a time is going to come where the Americans are going to leave it completely free. I don't think the Russians want that either. They want some sort of an American presence, though a reduced presence. The Chinese, I think, would also be quite happy with some form of American presence, because then they don't have to be responsible for that area. Very complex situation by which people actually want the Americans there. India certainly wants the Americans there. It is to our strategic interest. But I don't think the Chinese and the Russians are averse to American presence, but a reduced presence by which they can also play a major role. The security component, to some extent, of the Americans can fill, then the Chinese and the Russians can do their own little bit of power play in that particular area.
Right.
But I think the most worrying thing is that if the Taliban comes back into power, under any sort of sharing arrangement, they will assume total control. It is, I find it very hard to believe by which people say that, okay, the Taliban will come in, they will share power. The Taliban will not share power. They will take it all. And I think that is one fact which we must understand. And I think worse will be they will take back the country many, many years.
Right.
The Afghan women, they fought very hard to get into a better lifestyle now, to get their freedoms. I think they're going to lose all those freedoms at one stroke.
Sure.
So those are the problems which I think the Afghans will have to handle on their own. For India, the problem is going to be terrorism, because if the Taliban assumes control there, a large number of those fighters are most likely then they would like to come. They would like to come to India or to Pakistan, because they've also got their own problems of the Durand line.
Right.
So let's see which way it plays out. But it will be there will be concerns as far as India is concerned.
Absolutely. Okay, closing comments now from all my guests, starting first with you, Pramit. As far as some of the domestic issues are concerned, something that the ambassador touched upon in his previous remark, as far as the impeachment proceedings, as far as Trump is facing back home, or the protests that we are facing here in India, how much of all of this is going to have an impact on the bilateral relationship?
Well, as far as Trump is concerned, the impeachment has had absolutely no damage to his political standing. In fact, his latest polls indicate his support has actually increased thanks to the impeachment process. It's mobilized the Republican base. And he's actually seen his approval rating rise to 46% from about 42, 43. So whatever else is happening at the Republican base of his support is not shifting at all. The real question remains is, where do the independent vote, about a quarter of the American vote, which remains in play, and that will depend to a large extent on who the Democrats choose as their candidate. If they go too far left, a lot of those independents. So that's a game in play that we don't. But so far, I would argue the impeachment has had no impact on Trump domestically. The second issue that you've mentioned, which is the increasing criticism, largely from the left wing of the Democratic Party, on what's happening domestically in India, whether it's Article 370 or the Citizenship Amendment Bill and so on. That is a concern, and right now at least one of the Democratic leading candidates, Bernie Sanders, has come out publicly and attacked us. The others have remained more or less quiet on this issue. And that's going to be a bridge we're going to cross. We'll have to see how far who the Democratic side comes to dominate their political system, and how many of the left wing come to power. We were, for example, extremely nervous that the British Parliament in this election was going to be the most hostile to India because there was an unusually large number of left-wing and Muslim candidates, all of whom had expressed things. But as it is, almost all of them went down in defeat in the British election. So that basically became a zero issue as far as we were concerned. So we'll see what happens, but I think what we are going to have to show eventually is that the process in what is happening in Kashmir is ultimately to create a more democratic environment over time.
Right.
The Citizenship Amendment Bill is fundamentally about giving greater refugee and asylum to people seeking it from outside the country. So these are issues that will ultimately, those opinions will change once we actually are able to implement them and show what they're really about.
Okay, all right. And Ambassador, what does 2020 look like for the bilateral relationship between India and the United States?
Well, the Americans will be very busy with the presidential election which will be taking place that year. Trump, as Pramit rightly mentioned, has strengthened his support within his voter base. But of course, an election is an election, and he, as well as everybody else who matters in the American political system, will be very busy. We have to iron out our problems, particularly in our own neighborhood. You mentioned that the situation in Afghanistan is such that it may cause us some concern. Certainly it will. And that is why we have made sure that in the joint statement there is a mention that the Afghan process. Because what we don't want is a Pakistan-controlled Afghan peace process. The Americans have been willing to let the Taliban play a role which is certainly disconcerting. We have to play our cards very carefully in 2020. First of all, to sort out our own bilateral issues with the United States on trades, on H-1B visas, on defense cooperation, because the Americans want to have a greater and greater chunk of the Indian defense market. At the same time, we should use whatever relationship that exists or whatever direction it involves to our advantage, particularly in regard to Pakistan, China, and wherever else we are facing certain difficulties.
Okay, all right. And General, close the show for us with your brief concluding remark on the best way forward.
Now, I think one of the things which we should keep in mind is that when a relationship is going forward, there will always be blips. So when a blip occurs, what has happened to that relationship, I think we should take it as part of the system. This is an upward moving relationship and it is going to continue to grow. But during that growth, there will be blips, which I think should be understandable. It is something like a statement which was issued by the International Commission for Religious Freedom when they made out a statement. Now, I really don't think we should take those statements seriously, which I have mentioned in one of these programs here only. But at the same time, because what you need to fundamentally understand is the State Department doesn't take them seriously. So when statements are made by political leaders in the United States, they have a domestic audience, and they are also a very thriving and noisy democracy like ours. So everything which is said by each and any senator of the Americas doesn't really should not really perturb us too much. Having said that, I think this relationship is going to grow. It still needs a lot of nurturing, but I think both the countries are strategically aligned. Everything is aligned perfectly at this point of time, and 2020 will only make it go better.
Okay, all right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of India's World. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. We'd like to hear from you as well.